The topic of this video focuses on the ratification process for the Constitution. So, ratify is like a fancy name for approve, and the 50 plus founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention knew that what they came up with was eventually going to have to be looked at and approved by more people than just themselves. So, the process they lay out is that after they drew up the Constitution, they sent it to each of the 13 states. The rules that they established that are specified in Article 7 of the Constitution are that as long as 9 out of 13 of the states agreed, they would actually take effect and jump from being just a proposal to like the actual supreme law of the country. So like 9 is that magic number that needed to approve the Constitution for it to kick into effect. So basically what happens is that every state is going to have special elections to decide whether or not they approve or disapprove of what the founding fathers came up with in Philly in 1787. And two groups form almost immediately: the Federalists, who are in support of what was drawn up at the Constitutional Convention to replace the Articles of Confederation, and the Anti-Federalists, anti prefix meaning against, that are opposed to the new Constitution and feel like what was developed by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention might actually be more dangerous than what were the problems with the Articles of Confederation system. So real quick, let's just look at sort of like the individual sort of like stances of each group. So we're going to go anti-federalist first. So the anti-federalists, as we just mentioned, opposed the Constitution. They definitely did not believe that the Articles of Confederation system was like great, but they felt like sort of the delegates at the convention went way beyond what they were expected to do. They thought that they were going to sort of just patch up the Articles of Confederation system, and were very much horrified to see that they had gone way beyond that task. And instead of patching up the Articles of Confederation, they essentially blew it up and replaced it with a brand new system of government, one in which they felt was actually more dangerous than the Articles system itself. Some of the key anti-federalists, Patrick Henry, sort of from the American Revolution time, he's the "Give me liberty or give me death" guy. Richard Henry Lee, maybe another person from American history that you know, were very much opposed to a lot of these new ideas in the Constitution. One of the major arguments that they had was that they saw the system created by the Constitution as one in which the regular people just wouldn't have enough like power. That this was going to be a government dominated by like the rich, wealthy like interests, and that's something that we'll focus a little bit more on when we look at some of the anti-federalist like writings. Another one of the arguments of the anti-federalists was that they believed that this country was just too large for a democracy to work, that there was no real practical example of a democracy thriving in an area as large as the United States. And they're also very concerned that there was no specific mentioning of any rights that individuals would have in this new government. So the lack of a Bill of Rights was something that very much was concerning to the Anti-Federalists. And there are other elements that concern them. The creation of like a president that reminded them very much of like a king, which obviously they still had quite a bad taste in their mouths from what they had just been through with the British. This new government was definitely going to have the ability to tax, like that concerned them. This new government was going to have a strong like military. All of these things, like a singular leader, taxation, a military, like it reminded them of what they had just revolted from not that long ago with British rule, and it was a great concern to them. On the other side, the Federalists supported the Constitution. They looked at the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation being like dire, right? And like this was a much needed fix to ensure the survival of this like young new nation. Some of the heavy hitters on the Federalist side were people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And again, we're going to look a little bit more at some of the specific writings of the Federalists, but they actually wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, written under the pseudonym or pen name of Publius, which was someone who had fought against like the ancient Roman like monarchy and helped to establish democracy. So they thought this was like pretty similar. So they wrote these essays under the pseudonym of Publius, so people wouldn't be biased by the fact that like they were obviously like James Madison was at the Constitutional Convention. He has a rooting interest in its like ratification, but they thought that people would be able to give their like writings more of an honest like read if it was like under this like pseudonym. So again, they focused on many of the article's problems, and one of the answers that they have to like all of the anti-federalist arguments is that this isn't going to be a repeat of the British system because there are like built-in mechanisms within the new system that would prevent power from being abused, like separation of powers and checks and balances. And it wasn't that they to answer this particular like argument of like no Bill of Rights. It wasn't like they were opposed to rights, but their fear about writing down rights that people had would be that future generations would interpret that list to be the only rights that people had. And they were fearful that they wouldn't be able to come up with a comprehensive list that would include all of the necessary rights. So they weren't opposed to rights. They were opposed to specifically writing them down because they were fearful that this would be misinterpreted by future generations and future government officials. So you have these elections in sort of each state, these votes that take place. And again, remember, 9 was the magic number. Um, Eventually, the Federalists realized that there was massive opposition to some of their proposals. And one of the things that they were able to promise the Anti Federalists would be that if they approved this new system of government, they would relent and they would put a Bill of Rights into the document in the form of amendments. And the Anti Federalists sort of bought into that promise, and this is what caused in many states the vote to actually be approved in favor of the Constitution was this future promise of a Bill of Rights, which obviously is followed through on and is added. That's one of the key sort of like moments in these debates. You can see Delaware was the first state to ratify the Constitution, which is why they get the fancy nickname as the first state. We're number 2, Pennsylvania, so on and so forth, all the way down to number 9, which is New Hampshire. New Hampshire is that magical ninth state that sort of makes it go into effect. But obviously, the Federalists can't just be happy after the ninth state because you have like major states like New York and Virginia, 2 of the more populated states at the time, that had yet to sign off on it. That's where those Federalist Papers really come into play. They're like super influential in sort of convincing Virginians and New Yorkers to support the document, and eventually Rhode Island, who really looked at this as a major problem because they went from having equal power in the Articles of Confederation system to obviously not having equal power, especially in the House of Representatives under the constitutional legislature. They held out as long as they could, but 3 years after Delaware first approves the Constitution, Rhode Island jumps on board, and you have all 13 states that have ratified it. So this is just a little explanation of sort of like the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and something that we're obviously going to review a lot more in class.